Welcome to Reward Nerds, the podcast that deep dives into the areas of compensation and benefits. My name is Jon, and I'm your host, and I'm your fellow Reward Nerd. Welcome to this episode of Reward Nerds. I always look forward to this episode, but I think this one may be even more than most. And today, we are talking about pay transparency very, very often, not every time. Today, we maybe have the rock star of pay transparency with us. We have a member of the European Parliament, and that's Kira Marie Peter-Hansen. She was one of the two chief negotiators for the directive itself. Welcome, Kira.
Thank you very much. It's
great to have you here. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I was talking about, how do we introduce you? Because there are so many things to put into this. So number one thing I think that has impressed us also is that already back in 2019, you got elected to the European Parliament as the youngest member of the Parliament ever. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Yes, 21-year-old.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll get into some of the pieces that happened in the first period, because that's, of course, when the Pay Transparency Directive was shaped. You ended up being the chief negotiator together with Samira. So that journey, we'll talk about that and what actually happened. A lot of people want to know about that piece as well. And then in last time around, you got re-elected. Is it in 24, right? 24, and you got the most votes, personal votes of anyone in the country. So apparently you did something really good in the first
Maybe
period.
It was pay transparency.
Maybe it was pay transparency. So let's we'll talk about that process. We have a few themes today. The day of the recording now, we're very close to June 7th, the big official deadline for the Pay Transparency Directive. And we'll have to talk about, why are we where we are today, a bit around the political process about that. And then we have, a few days before this recording, set the questions out on LinkedIn and to our people that we were dealing with, what questions would they like to ask you in the position you're in? And it all stems around what happens now. How are companies going to react to the reality that there are delays? How much delays will the European Parliament and the Commission accept? What will happen if a country is more than just a bit delayed, but even more so? Will there be fines? Will there be other repercussions? How should companies plan for this? So there's so many themes that we'll go into. But today, number one thing, I just want to make a disclaimer first. This podcast is not about legal advice. You're not a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. This is us talking as professionals around this, you as a politician, me as a practitioner. So that will be the theme of things. We're not going to go into technical details per country, because there will be so many details, then this would be a 9-hour podcast and we'll make 55 mistakes. So we'll keep to the broader themes. So let's nerd around that.
Sounds good.
Right. So maybe just start first then, in terms, so you got in there in 2019, and not long thereafter, you ended up getting involved with Pay Transparency. Could you take us through that journey?
Yeah, so I think the political setting is, of course, important. We were, like the Greens got a really good election, the group that I'm representing, and you had a new movement in politics with especially the green transition, but also gender equality at the center. A lot of new, younger MEPs got elected. And with this, Ursula von der Leyen, the Commissioner President, also became elected and had gender equality as one of her key priorities, both within her own commission with the gender balance, but of course also in the legislative aspects. So she announced quite early on, also after pushes from the center-left and the trade unions and others throughout the years, that she would present a pay transparency legislation. The background for this was, of course, and maybe all the listeners already know this, but we've had gender equality in our treaties since 1957. We still don't have it. The member states also received a recommendation in 2014 saying, you need to do something. We won't tell you what to do, but do something. Otherwise, we will come with legislation. The member states didn't do that much, so we came with legislation. So that's kind of the political background for why it came. And then I was at that point the coordinator, which is a kind of spokesperson in the Employment Committee. And it was both the Employment Committee and the Gender Equality Committee who were allowed to negotiate this directive. And then we managed to get it as a green group. It was packed together with quite some other impressive initiatives, the Minimum Wage Directive, the Platform Directive, the directive on having a social security pass. So a broad pool of legislation that should push Europe to be a more fair and just Europe. And then we got the Pay Transparency Directive.
And then somehow you got in the middle of all of this as an individual as well. So how was that process? Could you take us through just a little bit, how does that even work? There's going to be a lot of negotiation going back and forth. It's broader in scope, more narrow in scope, and somehow in the end you land with the current directive.
Yeah, so the Greens got it in the Employment Committee, the Liberal Group Renew got it in the Gender Equality Committee, and then those groups appointed me and Samira to be the chief negotiators. And what we did in practice was that, of course, we had the Commission proposal as a starting point. And then each of us individually made our own proposal of how should the directive look from a Green and a Liberal perspective. And then we tried to merge that, ended up with a common proposal as co-rapporteurs or co-negotiators. And then we had to get all the other groups to say, is Samira and my proposal good or bad? Here, for example, in the scope, one of the things Samira and I proposed was that the threshold should be only 50 employers as the starting point. Some other groups thought maybe it should be 500.
So for the reporting?
For the reporting, yeah. So we had to negotiate all of these. We also had long negotiations on what should be included in the right to information. What information should you get? And also what should be the role of trade unions, of collective agreements, and so on. But we had a really, really good and amazing team of negotiators in the parliament. I think back then I felt they were very strong, and sometimes they had really bad opinions. But looking back now, it was a wonderful team and a political setting that really made us that really made it possible for us to take some big steps when it came to gender equality. And fortunately, a lot of them are still MEPs, so they're still fighting the good fights.
Great. And then everything kind of got concluded and it was clear this was coming. That was back in 23. And then all of a sudden, there are 3 years to transpose this to local laws and local legislation per country, hitting June 7th this year, 2026. And now we're here just a few days prior. And all we can see anyway is that Slovakia seems to be on time. A couple of other countries have, bits and pieces that looks like it may be on time. We may and may not get Italy, may not get Bulgaria. But the rest, basically out of 27 membership states, we're down to clearly less than a handful is going to be ready on time in full. So what does that tell you? Is this surprising? Is this normal in the EU?
I wouldn't say it's normal, but there's a lot of things in my understanding of what Europe and the EU is that have been shaken quite a lot in the last couple of years. I think one thing to be aware, when we are discussing implementation, is that normally all the member states have 2 years to implement EU legislation. So for most legislations, it's 2 years per standard. We agreed as a parliament at the last negotiation with the member states to say 3 years, especially because Germany was pushing. So member states already got an extra year, which is not normal in EU politics. So now wanting to have extra time is also quite provocative towards the institution being the European Parliament, because we already gave them extra time. And I think this is good for everyone to be aware when we have to also say why companies have had enough time to implement this. Now I lost track of what your main question was, Jon.
No, whether it was surprising that we're delayed, because
yeah.
we clearly are delayed. We can't change that fact now.
Yeah. I think in some ways it is surprising, and in other ways it's completely logical. It's surprising because it's not supposed to happen. Like if we have EU legislation that member states don't implement at the agreed time, and this becomes a pattern, the whole EU system breaks down.
Yeah.
Because then we can't trust each other, we get unfair competition, there's no certainty on what rules apply, like the system will break down. On the other hand, it's like, I think when I look at it now, of course it's delayed because we're in a political context that's just very different from when we adopted the directive. And I think today it would probably not be able to adopt, at least not this directive in its form, but maybe also not a directive at all, because the political focus has shifted so much. So it's shifted from being green transition, social union, gender equality, how do we improve fairness in general, to now be about competitiveness, US demands, geopolitical uncertainty, all of this, simplification as a main theme, which means that member states in many ways, unfortunately, also feel like they have a free pass to just do what they want and ignore the common rules we have. So looking at the political context, I would say, of course, it's delayed. But that doesn't mean it's not a really, really serious problem, not only for pay transparency, but also for the European Union in general.
Yeah, and that's also, I think, what many have been speculating on. How does this practically happen? Now, one thing, I mean, everyone obviously is aware the political landscape has shifted, in the broadest possible context and geopolitical terms in any kind of way and shape and form. So that is an obvious things in the back for everyone there. But at the same time, I think many have speculated, well, if nothing happens with this, if there's no consequence, then what, right? And I think in many ways it's also a matter of what does it mean to the countries is one thing, but what does it mean to the companies? So you just said, for example, with 3 years, yes, it should be sufficient time to prepare, if they knew exactly what to prepare for. and this is where we're coming to. There's no doubt that we as practitioners and also advisors have been saying, look, you may not know the final details, the full final details of every single country, but the minimum requirements, which are quite extensive, right? And so prepare for those. And then the finer details on each specific country on bits and pieces that can be added on when that is ready. So I would say 90% of the preparations could have been done from the offset, but the speculations, especially from many executive teams, have been, will it now happen at all? Right? That's been the number one thing that kind of moved this whole thing of going to a pause. There are many, many big companies now that started and then partly pauses things. One thing is practical, say we cannot finalize for Poland or we cannot finalize for a certain country because the finer details aren't ready. That is fair, but also many executive teams are saying to the rewards teams and HR teams, well, let's pause for a second, because there are indicators such as Sweden saying, no, we will not only delay, we are protesting, we want to renegotiate. And so that is digging into one of the big themes right now. But let's just take that from the start. So in general, when a directive comes out, do countries in the end up implementing it?
Yes, I would say so. Of course, we do see member states not implementing. Like Denmark is not implementing all the environmental laws we should. Other countries are also not implementing some legislation, but in general, member states implement EU legislation. And I haven't seen the amount of not implementing or challenging as we see with pay transparency before. Of course, I've only been there 7 years, so
well, 7 years is not just weeks, right?
But I haven't seen it before, and I think it's due to of course, the political environment shifting, but also a very different, that the EU has really taken a turn with these omnibus packages. Because what they did, of course, you can discuss the content of them, but what they did was they allowed member states, as Sweden, to say, we actually don't care, we want to renegotiate, we want to challenge that. And member states have never been able to do that before. Like they couldn't do that, there weren't the political space for that. But these whole omnibus process have created that. And in a way, it also makes sense, because if you pause legislation, as we did with CSRD, this sustainability reporting directive, or if you postpone it, or if you reopen it, everything can be reopened. So it's really changed the game for how we understand EU legislation, also when it comes to an enforcement perspective, which is quite damaging and quite challenging, both for companies, for lawmakers, and for Europe as a whole.
And so we probably need to take that theme in some detail, I believe, because let's take the first step. So trying to take it in a slightly correct, order of things here. So the first thing, at least that I saw, was Holland saying that they would be delayed until January 1st, and this is now half a year ago or so that they kind of announced that. There was a reaction pretty swiftly from the Commission, even with a formal letter. I can't recall whether it was addressed to Holland or it was addressed in general, that delays are not expected, and again, in the easy version of this you can elaborate, but basically acknowledging that we will stick to June 7th, that is the date, and we expect member states to comply with that. So that was the first step. So how did you see that process?
Well, up until the Dutch implementation there, or the Dutch announcement, there had been a lot of discussions on should the pay transparency be omnibused or should it be reopened.
Right.
Then the Netherlands comes with this announcement, and then it's actually us as parliamentarians who sends a letter to the Commission saying, "Have you seen these news from the Netherlands? What do you reply?" And then we asked 3 questions, being, will you stick to the implementation deadline? How will you enforce EU legislation and so on? And did that cross-party with some of the MEPs who had negotiated the law. And then the Commission came, luckily, unfortunately, with this quite direct answer saying, yes, we will stick to the timeline. And that was politically important for us to get that response, because it meant that we wanted to force the Commission to take a stance, because there was so much uncertainty and no one knew what they wanted to do. And luckily they took a stance, at least formally and in theory, of saying that they wouldn't delay or allow delays in implementation, or they wouldn't formally allow delays in implementation for the whole directive. So I saw that as a really good step, and a step that also gave a push to the organizations who want to renegotiate or delay the pay transparency. But of course, the EU is only as strong as the Commission is. So when the Commission is accepting that the Netherlands is delaying the transposition, it's also difficult, no?
Well, of course, if it's if one country has an acceptance, unless there's very, very specific circumstances, then obviously it opens for others to be able to do the same.
Yeah.
Right, and then some weeks passed, and we started seeing a couple of other cases, and Denmark was one of them. I personally, since we are in Denmark, I followed that one even more in detail, and it came out, the Danish draft came out the same day as the election was announced. It didn't feel like a random timing, and thereby also practically, proposing a delay till January 1st. And then we started seeing a number of countries doing the same. The list of countries kind of announcing, January 1st being a date is growing pretty fast. And then there are other countries that are aiming, in theory anyway, for now June 7th, but they have, or a date very close to it, but they have, this practical delay in saying, well, once that is finally agreed, either a president signs it or the parliament approves it, then it's another 3-6 months before the law is actually taking into practical measures, and thereby for companies to start complying. So that delay is an extra delay on top. So one thing is, when do they actually approve it? When is it signed, and when do actually companies then need to start acting? So I assume the original thought, when there's a 3-year period for them to transpose, then it's about, in theory, the effective date should have been June 7th.
Yes. Yes, and I think, yes, definitely. And the member states know this as well, so they're also not playing by the books. It's quite often that member states are very late in implementing EU legislation, and they push it to the end. In Denmark, we experienced it with the Work-Life Balance Directive, quite similar to the Pay Transparency Directive, because it needs to be first agreed by the social partners. How do you want to implement it? And that was also done quite last minute.
Yeah.
And that, of course, creates risks for not applying at the deadline. My impression is that many of the member states have officially announced announced to the Commission that they will be delayed, and that the Commission is also granted that delay in a way. I don't think the Commission should have done that, but at least it keeps us somewhat within the rule book in a way, because they're not openly challenging the Commission's response.
Yeah. And in a way, delays, I feel, is one thing. Again, it's like a matter of severity here. If we've had issues with inequality always, and we may finally fix it potentially with the directive. It's not fixing everything, but it could be a major step toward it. At least that's obviously the intention. So if that is delayed with half a year, I think all of us can sleep at night, as long as the process remains good and sound. But the speculations, that next level of speculations, was when Sweden, to me, very surprisingly, came out with their announcement that they want to renegotiate altogether. And for that one, I honestly, as a practitioner, based on the first letter, expected an even faster and stricter letter from the Commission saying, look, we may and may not expect or accept delays for a certain period of time, but when it comes to renegotiating, that's off the table. So what's the process like when it's a more severe thing, which in many ways this is? How does that process look like?
Well, I think you shouldn't be worried that there is not a direct response from the Commission to the Swedish announcement. I think it stems from the fact that the Commission has not been asked officially. So we forced them to answer in the Dutch situation. We haven't forced them to answer in the Swedish situation because we didn't send a letter. We didn't ask them. And so don't lose any sleep over the comparison between the Commission response. And I think the Commission is also trying to balance how much focus do we put on this topic? Because, of course, if you also give air to a discussion on renegotiation, you also make that discussion real. And I think that's also a consideration from the Commission side. But then, will it happen? What are the risks and so on? I think some member states are, of course, pushing for renegotiation or for doing a stop the clock or or like delaying or reopening stuff. Or, for example, changing the threshold. And Business Europe, the business organization that we have also made a proposal for specific elements they want to change in the directive. I was worried for many months whether they would succeed. And I think it was also a discussion whether there should be an omnibus on pay transparency. But I feel quite confident that discussion is over. And that there will not be a renegotiation. There will not be an opening of the directive, which is really, really good. And I base that on the commissioners saying it directly to me, but also saying it in different media forum that they stick by the gender equality legislation and so on. So I wouldn't be worried personally, but again, this is not legal advice. I wouldn't be worried personally that it will be reopened. I think now there are some discussions on can there be a presumption of compliance or presumption of adequacy if you have a collective bargaining in the implementation period. That's the next thing that Business Europe is fighting for, which of course is, I would say, completely ridiculous. We also had this discussion when we negotiated in the Parliament. But in a way, I think we can also take it as a good sign because it might mean that Business Europe has given up on reopening the content of the directive and are now trying to look at the implementation because they see the other thing is unrealistic. So I'm as optimistic as I have been in the last year.
That's probably good news. and I'm not, I don't think necessarily that the rewards community or HR necessarily are all sharing every part of the directive, because it's still, there is a burden toward companies, and there is no doubt that also, even as a practitioner advising companies on this, we would also like bits and pieces to be slightly simpler. So just so people don't think that we're all just sharing every single item of any directive on, but I think what we really need is clarity.
Yeah.
Right. So I think one thing is the timing again. All right, so if it's delayed with half a year, we can all, in a way, live with it. What is difficult to navigate for is all the types of companies out there that are multinationals. Of course, the very, very big ones have big teams as well, and they have resources. But it doesn't mean that they know all of these details per country and how should they actually act. There are many, 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 many dilemmas with it. So most of all, I believe that the community, even the business community overall, and Business Europe, to me, they are representing the companies, after all, in the end, the sum of the big companies and the medium-sized companies and small companies. And we're talking to the same companies, and I feel we're hearing different messages. And I think that is a bit strange, because the message we are hearing from even the largest companies, and we're talking to very many of them, is not about them being against the directive. They're against some of the, call it the paper requirements around it, but there is some of that that they may be against. But most of all, they want clarity now, because they want fairness. That's not the problem. They are, of course, some of them concerned about the costs. If, for example, we have been talking about this in the past, one of the things in the directive is a bit challenging under the employee's right to information is that we're talking about averages and not medians. And whenever you make a potential change to, let's just say there's one person that has been indeed discriminated in a group, and you end up rectifying that and fixing it, then all of a sudden it impacts everyone else in the group they're part of, because there's a new average, and then you kind of could keep on going forever. So that one detail is the one that I think concerns the most companies, because it also, for small groups, it doesn't take a lot for the average to be significantly different from something else with just one or two outliers. So I think that's kind of one of the main concerns for the companies is that kind of thing. But overall, they support the concept. But I think they're uncertain about how long do they have to fix things, for example. And what if they have a 20% gap in a country that is relatively small and it's a low profit margin business? And it's not necessarily wrong with the gap. It sounds terrible. But when you look at the positions, they may all be very different for different reasons, historical reasons, and they can't afford just to raise the salaries of all females to the same level on the same day. Then they will be unprofitable, and they will have to lay off somebody. So these kinds of dilemmas is the challenge. And I think if it was full clarity from the Parliament side that this is the date it's implemented, and that goes across Europe regardless, and you have 2 years or 3 years to be fully compliant, to be within a certain percentage, etc. I think that is from a practitioner perspective has been one of the biggest challenges, has been that I think for probably good reasons, there are many things with regards to flexibility in the directive. There is a lot of flexibility with regards to what methodology you use. That sounds very nice. But actually the feedback we're getting is we would like less flexibility, we would like clarity, because with every flexibility there's an uncertainty. So what does it practically mean? So I think the sum of it all in that sense is that companies really would like clarity. They want to prepare, but they need to know what they're preparing for. And what I am hearing now is that there's a very, very small to non-risk that it will completely be stopped as it is. It would also be, again, towards the EU, that will be a big failure because there are major countries that are about to implement. Italy is right around the corner, and it's a major economy in Europe. So if they are on time and implement everything, and then all of a sudden France chooses not to, that in itself also creates problems, especially for multinationals that have employees in both locations. What does that practically mean? Okay, that was I'm not even sure that was a question. It was more a statement, I believe. But I think the reflection, is that it seems to me, without knowing the full background of why Business Europe is saying what they're saying, I understand the overall concept, and we see it in the local countries as well, of wanting to minimize any thing that is regulating companies. That's, of course, a political background. But at this stage, what I would love to see from the Commission side is that they are very clear, and I think I do understand that some things you do behind closed doors, potentially a chat with Sweden and all of these things, but that chat would have closed so many speculations if it was more in the open. Because you saw, not long after, we saw Estonia coming with a very similar situation. I was thinking, oh no, now we're getting this big snowball effect. And then somehow, 24 hours later, that was almost reverted again, as if nothing happened. And thereby that, to me, tells me somebody called somebody, is to say, look, this isn't the way we're playing. But is there any chance for the Commission to come up with a clear statement around this?
Yeah, and I think maybe here, this is just my own conspiracy theory, but Kaja Kallas, the Estonian commissioner, is also a VP. She's very high in the commission. So I could imagine that they've told Estonia to not do this, because it is, to the best of my knowledge, it is a very, very big priority for the Commissioner President von der Leyen to get this directive through. I won't expect that we get anything from the Commission before the deadline. Then they are saying, I think they're saying now, and forgive me if I already said this one before, but that 17 member states have already implemented. That's their own story from the Commission.
That's a different narrative.
It's a very different narrative, and we're trying also to engage in a dialogue with them to say it's simply not true. They're basing it on the fact that, for example, a country like Denmark already had gender pay transparency legislation in some way, but clearly it's not the directive. It's really foolish to say that Denmark has implemented just because we have an old law on pay transparency. But that is kind of what they're hanging their hat on, probably also because it's more comfortable for the Commission. But I would expect them I think they're aware in a way that they need to, that it is sensitive, but that they also need to stand for the directive. But I won't expect them to do it very much in the open because politically it's too costly for them in a way.
But in the same way that you send a formal letter around the reaction to Holland, if indeed you had been sending, I'm not meaning you, it could also be you, but of course the parliamentarians towards the Commission asking for a formal response to the Swedish situation, would the Commission then be responding in a way that would be visible?
They would at least have to respond.
Yeah.
Then, of course, politicians can respond in many different ways, some clear and some less clear ways. But the tools that we do have as a parliament, for example, in ensuring that the Commission is enforcing is that, we can send letters. We can also do different hearings. I also recently figured out that we can do these implementation reports. This will come later in the process, but maybe in 3 years' time, looking at what worked in implementation, what didn't, what are the best practices, etc. And then we often also have these monitoring groups on how is the implementation going. So the Parliament can choose to have a very clear focus on implementation of specific files. We have it on the minimum wage directive, for example, where we follow that quite closely as an employment committee, and we could do the same with the pay transparency directive. And what we're trying to now then is to kind of regroup a little bit in the Parliament and figure out who are our allies within the different MEPs and how can we, what is the best way to go about it.
Very good. So I'm just wondering, somehow did Brussels, if we could call the European Parliament that, somehow underestimate the readiness for the companies, or is it more on the countryside?
I would say it's on the countryside. I would say the directive is implementable within 3 years. I think I've also realized afterwards that, of course, there are things in the directive that are difficult. And which we didn't expect to be difficult when we drafted the legislation. Everything from how do you understand equal value to what you were mentioning on average pay, all of this, which of course it would have been ideal if we had those conversations before the directive was there. I must say also Business Europe was not very active in influencing the legislative text. So there's also a responsibility there that could have helped. But so the directive is of course still has some difficult aspects to implement, but it is also doable. And I think it is the fault of the member states that they haven't, or that they've chosen. They bear the responsibility for the unclarity for companies. And they did that for political reasons with what happened around 2024 when there was this right shift in Europe. And the companies bear the cost for it.
They bear the cost for it, yeah. And maybe just addressing that one, this is one of the many different kind of questions around the companies and how things work for them. But clarity towards the companies. We've gotten this question in many different shapes and forms, and I also responded to it in a previous podcast. But, when a country is delayed and there is no legislation in that given country, but the company happens to be in many countries, then companies are asking, well, do we then need to comply with the rules? And our response has been all the time is, yes, in the countries where there is legislation, you absolutely have to. And we could also recommend you to follow it in other countries. But but the fact that a country has not implemented the legislation means that it doesn't count in that country. So it's been this question, as an EU citizen, if we would just call you that, do you then have the rights of an EU-wide directive that is in theory in place now, June 7th? Do you then have the right in a country which hasn't implemented it? For example, employees' right to information.
Good question. And this was also why we did the legal disclaimer in the beginning. So EU directive applies to member states and not to companies. So that means it applies to Denmark, to Sweden, to the Netherlands, and then they have the responsibility to enforce it towards companies. So if a country has implemented and you're operating in that country, you need to comply. Otherwise, you're in breach of national law. Then the golden question is, do you have the rights as an EU citizen then? I've just finished my bachelor degree. I took a course on EU law, but I'm not sure exactly how it interplays when the directive is not enforced yet in your member state. I would say that there probably would be a case following also the European Charter of Fundamental Rights and the EU legislation that stems from it. And we've also seen, for example, in Poland with some of the LGBTI legislation under the previous government, that you have EU rights as a citizen. But it would have to be up for the courts.
It would have to be up for the courts. And I think we have discussed it previously as well in some other kinds of details where it kind of came out that in theory maybe yes, but in practical terms no, because as long as you're in the country and it's not enforced by local law, it's not actually active. But I guess we can do a follow-up on that one at some point.
Maybe you should get like a gender equality lawyer in to speak about that, because it is interesting.
It is interesting, but again, none of these things, and this is also some of the challenges we're having. We're being asked for best practice in this and that and the other with these things, but again, the directive hasn't been implemented yet, so there isn't a best a best practice in full. There is also not this is how you became successful implementing it, because it hasn't been implemented. And the same thing goes with things like this. There hasn't been a court case on this yet. And so until there is one, we can all just guess. And some can guess more qualified than others, but we're basically guessing. I think my guess would also be that if you have the individual rights, it would be against the member state and not against the company, I would think. But okay. Let's not deep dive into that trap. It sounds like something we could... Okay, so... jumping a bit back and forth here in terms of what we're looking into. So we'll be talking about the politics now, in terms of the landscape, what happened throughout the period, anything that has changed quite a lot, basically, geopolitical situation, how the Commission ambition to gender equality and pay equity. Did you feel, by the way, with that, has the ambition in terms of gender equality and pay equity changed within the Commission?
Yeah, I would say it has, like both with having a less gender equal commission than we had before, but also with the lack of legislation, like looking at the last term, so from 2019 to 2024, we got the gender pay transparency legislation, we got women on board through, we got victims' rights directive, and we got the gender-based violence directive. So, and we got the first gender equality strategy. So we got several legislative and non-legislative steps. And in this parliamentary mandate, we haven't got any. Like, there's been a revision of the Victims' Rights Directive, but otherwise it's been down to strategies. And these strategies are less clear, less concrete, less ambitious. And then we've had one citizens' initiative on the right to abortion, which has been very successful, but it's not a commission initiative, it's a citizens' initiative. So definitely there is a change.
Okay. And then I think there's one thing that's been bothering me a bit, the discussion of whether it impacts the competitiveness. And it's a natural thing to come up with also from Business Europe or from others, are saying we need to be competitive, and whatever regulation, we're reducing our competitiveness as a continent. I somehow personally struggle with the argument. I'm saying, in theory, if you have 100 euros and you today you give 55 of that to the male and 45 to the female, it's not more costly to give 50-50. And of course there is this, okay, well, if you need to regulate one up and then you can still give 55 to the man and you need to give 55 to the woman as well, yes, then there's an increase. But over time, it's not more expensive to pay, equally to genders. So it feels like a strange argument. And the question is to that, if a lot of that could have been dealt with, if there was a very, very clear implementation period. One thing is the implementation of the directive being 3 years from the conclusion till it happened. But if it was another, for example, let's just say 3 years until you had to be very close to a zero number, and just fixing it over time, because then you could fix it through your recruitment processes and through your promotion processes and not necessarily increase individual salaries. So how has this argument been used? Do you know, in terms of saying that this will really impact the competitiveness of the European Union?
Yeah, it's mostly just been used that it's reporting requirements and it's burdensome. And I think, to me, it's also quite interesting because I would say that the reporting requirements is not the burdensome aspects. Like, it's other elements of the directive that are difficult than doing the Excel sheet or the tables or something like this. So I think it's also in a way a little bit lazy to come up with the argument without expanding it. And I think there's also missing a lot the fact that, at least in my generation, I'm 28 now, none of my friends would want to work in a company that doesn't have pay equality. So you're also losing talent. And talent is difficult to come by in Europe these days. So if you want to attract it, you also need to be open about how do you value, how do you pay, how do you progress as an individual, what is the impact and the vision of the company. That just matters a lot to the newer generation, and I think companies and Business Europe, for example, are missing that in their argument and are a little bit stuck in the 90s of how to conduct business.
That's strong.
Yeah, but we see it also, and it's a different example, but for example, the whole car industry. I think it's clear for everyone that, of course, we need to transition our car industry towards electrical vehicles. And we should have done it several years ago because China and the US are much more ahead of us. We're losing competitiveness on the car market, for sure. But still, Germany and the German car industry prefers to just stick with what they've always done, which is just... how do you say? Yeah, peeing to keep warm? Is that what you say?
Yeah, let's see that. Okay, so I have a number of specific questions I got from the industry, and I would like to go through some of those. But in terms of what is next, let's have that for a few minutes. So realistically, what do we expect? What do you expect now that we will see again with the current setting being 1 to 5 countries maximum being on time, another few that are just around the corner, and then looks like about 10-ish currently are saying about January 1st as the implementation date, and then we have a number where we have no clue. So what's your and one protesting being Sweden at the moment. So how do you expect us to move from here?
Well, my expectation would be that most of the member states during the fall will come with a proposal for how to implement it, and that it will be not very ambitious, and that they will also try to cut corners. For example, Sweden, I would expect that they will try to say, well, if you have a collective agreement, you are complying, and then they will send that into the Commission and say, this is how we plan to implement the Pay Transparency Directive. And then I think it's going to be very interesting, how does the Commission react to that? Will they accept that collective agreements are compliant per se, which they are not? Legally speaking, politically speaking, they are not. But will the Commission accept that, or will they not? And will they then engage or prioritize political capital to engage with countries in asking them to change the law? And will they publicly say anything? I don't think they will be very public about it, at least not in the beginning. But I think there will be some dialogue with member states. So I would expect that most countries have some kind of updated pay transparency legislation by January. But I would also expect it to cut corners. And that's, of course, the moment where companies then need to decide how do they want to do it, because you have still 27 different ways of implementing that you can look to, and you can also see what is working well in which countries. And if Sweden is not helping you as a company by just saying, oh, you comply if you have a collective bargaining, and we don't care about those companies that doesn't have it, you need to look somewhere else to understand what can you do. And again, also to check what fits your company.
And I think, first of all, many details in that. For example, if you have a collective agreement, let's just go down that route and say then thereby you're compliant. I don't know about a single company that has a direct, collective agreement covering everyone in the company, right? So you may have it. You may have a big production facility, and that may be 70-80% of your employees, but then you have a number of white collars, which are not part of that agreement. So then what? Fundamentally, you may then be signed off that you don't need to look into the blue-collar population. Okay, that would be a big, relief for a lot of companies saying, okay, let's not look at those. But then you still have the white-collar population. So it doesn't practically then change very much. And I also think, honestly, when we're looking at this for companies, the blue-collar population, if we can just call them that as a group, being those that are primarily the ones on the collective agreement, that's not the challenge. That group is so uniform. It may still be having issues, in terms of overtime pay or, shift allowances and, some of the individual negotiations that have been going on, and they may be skewed. But as a group, they're relatively quick to analyze. So I would also say in terms of how much of the burden that's being released based on that, that's tiny. That's a 5%er out of the total amount of time spent for a company maximum. So again, it feels like a silly discussion in a way, to be honest, from a practitioner side when we see how this is actually working. Could be a big political discussion for other reasons, but it doesn't feel very relevant when we look at it. Because again, what the company really needs to spend time on is having a really good, clear job architecture with clear leveling, knowing that they know who is, what is the definition of work of equal value, what pay components should be included, how do we actually analyze this, and what do we do in the cases where we have a gap that is too high. What do we have to do, and what should we do? And these things may not be the same. And that's where they really struggle, and especially where you have very different sizes of companies. Even the big multinationals with tens and thousands of employees, they may still have countries with 20 people and 10 people and 50 people. And those populations are tiny, which means it doesn't take a lot to have big deviations in percentages because you have tiny groups in terms of work of equal value. So I think that the collective bargaining agreement to me, interesting enough is such, but it's in reality it's a smaller issue. It's a big political issue. It means something to that. I mean, in theory, then you could just say, let's have a collective agreement for everyone in the company. We don't need to do anything. And
most companies don't have collective agreements. When you look around in Europe, also when we had the discussion in the European Parliament, it was pushed by Sweden already back then. And I think maybe Austria, and the Business Europe's director is also Austrian. So I think it's relevant or it could be relevant for a very few number of companies and countries in Europe. But for the majority, it doesn't cover it. So.
Yeah. And here comes I said we shouldn't do technical questions. And now I have a semi-technical question still, and we may not be able to answer it. But one of the key things that is within, for example, the employee's right to information is that there will be many cases where there are very small groups where you will see the individuals pay if you ask for the average of men and women, because frankly there's one woman or the very, very tiny groups. And we have seen attempts to look into how this is done overall for Europe. We have seen that one. We see some bits and pieces in the first suggestions, both in Holland and in Sweden. But for the overall one, it seems like the way to solve it is to show that data to an employee representative, being like a neutral third party to be able to see this. But I'm wondering how many companies actually have employee representatives. Because it feels like with the discussions I've been having the past few months that number is like 20-30% of the company's maximum. The rest don't. So then what practically do you do? Like it will be a new equality body, it looks like, in Denmark for these kind of cases. But I think, frankly, they would drown if they get all these individual cases from individual companies. Would have a backlog of years within a few weeks. So any reflections as to how practically, what's the thinking behind the employee representative?
Well, the thinking is that when we negotiated it, it was very, very important for us to ensure a strong role for the trade unions and for the workers' representatives, because the change we also want to push from left to right in the European Parliament was to say collective agreements are fundamentally better at ensuring equal pay, and workers' representatives play a crucial role in ensuring democracy and fairness at the workplace. So we wanted to push also companies in that direction. So that's why we gave the workers' representatives such a prominent role, to also give incentives to make sure that you have them in your company, but also to strengthen their role and their mandate. So there's a big political wish behind it. And echoing that wish here then would be to encourage your workforce to elect a representative and engage in a dialogue with them, because it can also hinder conflicts, and it can also give more ownership to the work group, that you have someone in the room speaking with the leadership. And I think also for the leadership, it can be a help, because like I'm managing also a team of 15 people as an MEP, and I try to say I know what they're doing and what their work life is like. But there's also gaps in my knowledge of what their work is about. So having workers' representatives there can also help clarify what is actually the type of work that is been doing. So that's the wish from the political side.
Okay. But currently, it doesn't have to be a huge thing to have a workers' representative. But the reality is just they don't have it.
Yeah.
And thereby again, if that is the political vision, something that's written into the law, in theory, would be easier than if it said you need to have one, right? But right now it's one of those many that seems a bit fluffy, because it's like it's a given, you need it in a way in order to deal with that situation, but there is not a demand that you have one. So then what do you do, right? So that seems fluffy.
Yeah. But I think also you can deal with it without having a workers' representative.
Sure, but I mean the situation is relatively often that you have small groups of people. Yeah. Let's just say you have 4 males and 1 female on a given level, being your category of workers. Yeah. And you're supposed to then show the average salary for men and women within the category of worker you're in. And there is only 1 female. And so how do you, without showing that individuals pay to everyone, how do you then go about that right to information? Yeah. And then the way we've seen that is you could show it, instead of showing it to that group, show it to an employee representative or a workers representative that does this on behalf of the group, being objective and being allowed to see that information, and thereby reporting back to say, look, there is no issue, or everything looks like there's something. But if there's no objective third party to look at that, then the question, how is that dealt with GDPR-wise? Yeah.
Okay, that's an interesting dilemma.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And it's a very real one, even for the biggest companies, because as I said, even the biggest companies have countries that are small. Yeah. And within a small country, if you have 30 individuals and you have 7 different levels in the organization, you will have groups of 5 and 6 people within a level. You may have 1 or 2 of a certain gender, and you end up in this situation quite often. Yeah,
because we've had the dilemma before, like how do you balance GDPR versus transparency, and so on. But it's interesting also with the link to then if the way to solve that has been through workers' representatives, what do you do when you don't have that? Yeah.
Well, it's one of the many practical dilemmas that companies are challenged with at the moment.
Yeah, I could imagine. Wish I had known 3 years ago.
Yeah. And I wish that, this is the overall thing, I wish that political processes very honestly has more involvement from practitioners in general. I mean, not just the EU, but also in the countries, because I do feel that there are many, many things within this directive, and I said we shouldn't talk about the IG tool and things like that, but we can see elements here. Things would have been different if practitioners had been part of the process to make it more simple, more usable. So that would be a nice challenge towards politicians in general to have that discussion. Yeah. Okay, so to make sure this doesn't become a 9-hour podcast, I will also make sure I focus on some of the actual questions here. And I have to say, there's a big interest from companies to ask you and thereby the Parliament a number of clear questions. So we did talk about right. So this one is interesting. Really, many of the medium-sized to large companies have had a leveling structure for years. They use one of the big global providers or they use something else. These ones have obviously been made in a completely different context than the EU Pay Transparency Directive. They may have been made 20 years ago. They typically talk about the impact of the role and these kinds of things, but it does not in detail do kind of the 4 key pillars, or I even call them 5, of responsibilities and skills, being both hard skills and soft skills, and effort and working condition. It doesn't have all of that. It basically has other elements. So a number of companies are then very uncertain. Do we need to change our current setup in order to make sure that it is compliant with what it says in the directive, or can we just keep our old system and they say we feel this is also objective, so we're good?
If I remember the directive language correctly, we say that you shall use these 4 criteria and then you can add on. So with this, I would say that they would have to change them.
Yeah.
Of course, they can still, like it's not a waste of work, and they have some experience with having pay structures, having categories, having factors, but they would need to change them. And I can say the reason why it's also a little bit concerning, I would say, but maybe I don't know the business well enough, that they've been based on other criteria. Because the reason why we are basing it on these 4 is because it's the international recognized ones from ILO that you should base it on to begin with. So I think their provider might have done it wrong 20 years ago, but that's of course late to say now. But I would say that they should update them.
Yeah. Okay. And luckily, I have to say that to those that are concerned out there, because that's a massive assignment if it sounds like you need to change your entire job architecture, which is not the case. But it's actually the case. You need to add a few extra words to it.
Yeah.
And we very often see that the structures they have, they are pretty objective and fair and sound. It's just they haven't specifically said what does this mean in terms of working conditions or effort, and certainly not soft skills. So soft skills is the place where most simply haven't. They mentioned the hard skills, they mentioned responsibilities, and maybe some other bits and pieces that are clear, but they haven't in terms of wording put anything on those elements.
And I think here what the directive also hopes to achieve is to make companies aware of soft skills, because we see they've been historically undervaluated, that they belong a lot to female workers and so on. So it's also a chance for companies to learn what is soft skills compared to working conditions or responsibility.
Yeah. And here's a question around, given the fact that there will be different timing on the different countries, how do we make sure, how can companies ensure that they do not overinvest in countries where legislation is delayed, or underinvest and thereby not be ready?
Yeah, good question. I think, I would probably try and seek a uniform implementation within my company. So making sure that it's the same structures and the same architecture I use for my Swedish, French, German, Danish brands, and then hope that the national implementation in those countries will allow for that. Because and that's a side note, but one of the issues we have in EU is, of course, that you have different national implementations, and when you do directives, they can go in very many different directions, and that's also a competitiveness issue. And companies, of course, don't have the responsibility to fix that issue. It's the member states who need to align more in the implementation. But I think both for the sake of Europe, but also for the sake of the competitiveness of the company, I would, to begin with, have a pay structure that can cover your whole company on the multi-level dimension, and then hope that this can also comply with the national laws.
Yeah, and but that's unfortunately the problem is companies don't like to hope that something complies with the laws in the countries, and because these are big changes, right? So nobody is accepting a reduction in pay. Yeah. So if you show a new, let's say, pay structure and a pay logic, and you end up publishing that, then that is kind of your minimum. Nobody accepts lower in a sense. So nobody accepts to get lowered. That means you can only increase. And nobody wants to create a situation where you end up creating inflation either for the wrong reasons. Yeah. So this is the key challenge. I hear what you're saying, but the companies don't like to hope. No. they want clarity. And I think that's one of the key things. When we talked a few years ago, actually, when the first time we met up for a roundtable, which was great, and thank you for coming. And back then we talked about what kind of guidance could companies get from the European Parliament or from the EU overall. Yes. And then we talked about it would be like almost like a center of excellence or a knowledge hub. I think a central knowledge hub in the EU to be somewhere where you could go and know what is the status of each country, etc. It's fair to say that one doesn't seem to exist. I've at least not seen it. Is there any plan in any way that there is a place where companies could go toward the European Parliament, the EU as an institution, to get clarity and objective guidance?
Yeah, I think we said in the directive that the Commission should come up with guidelines, especially tailored towards SMEs. And I think this was delegated to EIGE, who then came with the guidelines and the methodologies. So I think that is the extent we get that's the one. From the EU. Uh-huh. Going to EIGE, I think, also maybe the national equality bodies, if they're specialized in this, because they also have a role, but they also fill out very different functions in each member state. Not that much, and it's very much a shame, like also as a politician, because like we did the best we could when we drafted the legislation, and we said, make these methodologies, make these guidelines, be aware of that it's different if you're an SME than if you're a multinational. And now we're speaking so much also about bureaucracy and simplification and so on. But it's not really fulfilled what we asked in a way. And member states are also not providing the guidance that they could, because of course the different ministries could also make extra toolkits and guidance. They're just not doing it. And that's a shame, because then we just end up like running towards the wall and
Yeah. Okay. So in the end, on the country side, if we just close that one off in terms of the consequences for member states. So first the formal part, and then what we think will happen maybe. So formally, if not just with the EU directive, in general, if a country is delayed, at least I've heard, then in theory there should be fines for delays.
Yes.
And this is what we saw Estonia saying that one day when they said it is they would rather just pay the fines. Yeah. Which I assume must be quite provoking for the parliament to see. But if it seems like there may not be any fines, there is even a lower threshold in terms of saying we're going to be delayed. So how should it in theory be, and what do you actually practically see will happen here?
Yeah. So in theory, the Commission has a responsibility to enforce EU legislation. And how they do it is that they open a case against a member state, where then there is some time, they go into dialogue and so on, but they open a case saying you're in breach of EU law, and then the Commission can impose fines. But this is that is the theory. In practical terms, the Commission is also committed to be more strict on implementation and enforcement as part of this whole simplification process. So the new Commission is actually committed to it, in theory. Then in practice, what happens is that it's very political. It's national politics, it's party politics. I think the best example, I would say, was during the financial crisis. A lot of the southern countries, the Commission opened cases against them for breaching the debt levels. Yeah. But they didn't open cases towards Germany and Denmark when the same happened. So it's also, what are the big countries doing? What are the small countries doing? Is it a conservative, a social democrat? All of this. which plays into it, which is a shame.
Okay.
That's the wonders of democracy.
The wonders of democracy. Okay, so do we then expect right now that we'll see most countries ending up with January 1st as the date? Is that your feeling?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And I think also because, the Commission has quite openly said that they won't do anything before, openly in meetings with me.
Now it's open.
Said that they won't really do anything before the implementation deadline hits. And then,
but that deadline has been confirmed by themselves being now June 7th. So in theory, that means June 8th
but
they
then
can
you
start
need
asking.
to analyze a little bit what is the law, who didn't comply, and so on. And some of the member states also got extensions because of elections. For example, Denmark, Sweden has elections in September. All of this, Hungary not having a government when it had to be implemented, all of this. So some countries will have more time to implement. Yeah. But I think it depends also on the political pressure towards the Commission, how much will happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so let me just double check if we got all the questions right. So this is more in general then as well. So one thing, let's just assume no changes happened. It will be implemented January 1st in most cases, some way slightly more delayed, etc. Let's just take that for a second. Some speculations. I'm just taking the big ticket item here, Germany, the biggest economy. And the way I saw the statement that came from Germany some time ago was that they were basically saying as a government, it will happen in this election period. I read that as saying they're taking it on themselves to saying we will make sure it happens. And some journalists are saying that period runs until 2029, so it's going to be delayed till 2029. But let's play with the extreme of saying that is what they actually meant. That's not my interpretation. My interpretation is they will potentially be delayed, but they will take the responsibility for it to happen. Whatever that means in terms of timing. We need to get clarity as well. Germany is so big. We all need to know what's happening there. But what if a major economy like Germany ended up saying, look, we're doing 2029, so be it. How would that work out in the EU context?
Yeah, I actually haven't followed the German case very closely, so I also didn't know that they have said this. And I think Germany was one of the most difficult countries to negotiate with. It was during the former government, so you had the Greens in it as well, and then the Liberals and the S&D. And I think Germany is difficult when it comes to EU legislation because at least how it was back then was you could have one minister saying, for example, the gender equality minister, yes, we will implement, or yes, this is fine. And then you would have the business minister or finance minister saying something else. And then when they couldn't agree, they would just block everything. So they're really a difficult country to work with in an EU setting. And of course, they're also very powerful. And Merz has been attacking the EU quite a lot and the European Parliament for being slow for being slow when it comes to simplification and all of this. So politically, they're also difficult to go up against. I would expect and I would hope that the Social Democrats in the German government and the trade unions of Germany, who are very favorable towards this directive, will push back on the conservatives for on this. But I also, to be honest, I have very little hope for German politics in many ways. But I want to give some good vibes.
Good vibes,
in all of this. But that would be very concerning. But it would also create traction in a way. So it would also make it a very big political fight. And I think if it comes to be a very big political fight, I think we also have strong cards on our hands. And I don't think the Social Democrats of Germany could bear to not implement the Pay Transparency Directive, who they have been some of the proponents of as well. But
we previously talked about the process of if something actually ended up being reopened, this is not the route we're going. We don't expect it. It's very unlikely, etc. But if that indeed happened with an already decided, fully negotiated law that has been ready and just should be implemented. If you open that whole thing, that must be a massive process. It needs to go through the entire parliament again, or in voting and stuff. Or am I mistaken?
Yeah, but we saw it with the omnibus package on CSRD and CSDDD, so our due diligence legislation and sustainability legislation, came from a German push right before the elections in February, and it was a mess. And I think that process is also what started discussions on whether you can just reopen legislation or not. My hope would be that both the Commission but also the Parliament member states see that was not how you should do it. Like, if you want to change elements, you should do it very targeted and very kept in a box in a way, instead of reopening everything. Yeah, but it's I think European politics has never been so unpredictable as it has right now. At least not in my 7 years.
Okay.
Time.
So just to round things off, because we've been going on, and we could go on forever. There are so many things we could dig into, but it will probably become more and more speculative in a sense. And again, we want clarity, not speculations, I guess, out there. What would your recommendations be in the end here, if you're going to give a recommendation to companies now where they're sitting there struggling a bit to say, how do we go about this? The landscape is all over the place. We have a big or a small company for that matter, and we, of course, want to make sure that we're compliant, but we also not want to be the front runners. We don't have the finances and economy to be the ones pushing in the front, and it's not our fight to fight. We just want to comply with rules if it is. So what would your recommendation be to companies in terms of preparation and things now?
Well, my recommendation would be to implement the directive and to make sure that you have pay structures in place, make sure that you have an idea of how will you convey the right to information, and how will you engage in a discussion on evaluation of jobs. So you don't need to over implement or go over and beyond, but being prepared, I think, is the best thing you can do, because politics can shift very quickly. So I wouldn't hang your hat on the political wins. I would make sure that you are aligned with the legislation that formally has to be adopted, and then I would take the risk or the hope to implement it in a way that is most cost effective by trying to also make sure that you can use it in more than one member state if you're navigating more markets, and then being aware that, of course, I understand from companies that it can just be a compliance exercise, but you also get more out of it if you put in a little bit of effort, and that the gains are also there. Like, I think when you look, again, the green transition, I think, is a good comparison, because you've had the same with some companies being in the forefront, and now there's a political pushback. But I think when you look long term, those companies are better prepared for crisis. They know their risks better, their exposure better, and they attract more talent. And it's the same with the Pay Transparency Directive. Like, you will end up getting a more satisfied workforce and a more competitive company.
Excellent.
Yes.
Kira, thank you so much for nerding with me and with us and all of us, and answering all of these questions. I know that sometimes we're pushing a little bit, but not everything that politicians do are clear to practitioners and companies. So thank you so much for your open and candid answers to the questions.
Of course.
All right.
Thanks
thank
for
you.
having me.